Pokrovsk in Donetsk region, which is about 500 kilometers southeast of where I am here in Kiev, has been at the epicenter of fighting along the front lines between Russian and Ukrainian troops in recent weeks.
Russia's throwing everything it has at Ukrainian defences in Pokrovsk. Commanders reportedly under enormous pressure from the Kremlin to take the city and to get a significant victory as quickly as possible. While Russia has been making steady gains in rural areas, the last major city to fall to Russian troops was Avdiivka back in February 2024.
We're going to take a bit more time and look at what's going on in Pokrovsk, who controls what in the city. We're going to ask whether there's a risk of Ukrainian forces there being encircled and surrounded. We're also going to ask what it will mean if Russia gets control of Pokrovsk, what that will mean in terms of strategic gain, what that means for Ukraine's defenses elsewhere. We're going to ask whether this could have been avoided or at least slowed down. And we're also going to have a look at what the winter means. We're a couple of weeks away from freezing temperatures, and we're going to ask how that will play out, whether we'll see fighting slow down. How much of Pokrovsk does Ukraine still actually control? Now, there's no independent verification, no journalists on the ground. Obviously, it's too dangerous for that. So it's all a question of fragments of video, of pictures doing the rounds on Telegram, being analyzed by people who can then try and verify the images, try and compare them to landmarks and other things that can be identified to actually work out where different things happened, and hope to be clear also about the chronology if the pictures published are actually up to date. And then obviously we've got claims from both sides who are often overstating what they actually control versus areas where they might have been and then withdrawn back after. Most analysts still talk about downtown Pokrovsk being a grey zone. That means that both sides can be operating the same areas, not necessarily at the same time. There are reliable reports of Ukrainian units still hauled up in government buildings in the downtown, even though we understand the Russians are operating around it. We put that question of who controls what in Pokrovsk to Yuri Butusov. He is one of Ukraine's most well-known military journalists, someone who's been a long-term critic, vocal critic of the current Ukrainian military leadership, and who is actually now serving in the military. But he's certainly not someone who is towing the line. And he's right now at the front lines, albeit not in Pokrovsk. This is what he had to say.
В самому Покровськ, тобто половина міста, знаходиться під нашим контролем, наші війська закріпляються там. Я не бачу зараз необхідності швидко виходити з Покровська, нема для цього ніяких тактичних передумов. І насправді для нас це було б невигідним кроком.
So if you listen to Butusov and other Ukrainian analysts on Telegram, for the most part, they would say that Ukraine still controls large parts of the northern half of Pokrovsk, especially north of the railway line, and Russia is now increasingly establishing its control in the south, and then between those two parts of the city you have the grey zone where both sides are still operating. Is Pokrovsk about to be surrounded, and are the Ukrainian troops there going to be encircled? That is the central question for public opinion here in Kiev, across Ukraine. People here remember all too well previous battles for these eastern Ukrainian towns, places like Bakhmut and Avdiivka, where we saw significant numbers of Ukrainian troops being taken prisoner by the Russians because that order to leave happened simply too late and it wasn't safe to get out anymore, and they ended up being taken captive. That is something that people here are adamant shouldn't happen again. If you take a step back and look at the map, you should try and differentiate between Pokrovsk and its satellite town of Mirnograd. So Pokrovsk is slightly to the west and is more open, as it were, to Ukrainian-held territory. Mirnograd, slightly to the east, only a few kilometers away, is already surrounded on three sides by Russian-held territory. So that is a lot more of a kind of precarious situation to be in. That doesn't change the fact that all these areas are under attack by Russian drones and Russian artillery. So even if you are leaving Pokrovsk further away from Russian control, you're still likely to be attacked, especially during daylight hours if you try and take those roads. There are images doing the rounds of burnt out cars, destroyed cars along all of those routes in and out. We put that question to Frank Ledwidge, someone who was formerly in the British military and is now at Portsmouth University, someone who follows this war in great detail, very closely, whether he thinks Pokrovsk is likely to be surrounded and what the risk is that Ukrainian soldiers will end up being encircled and taken captive there.
Will it fall? The answer is certainly yes. And the concern, I think, of many independent observers and many Ukrainians is that the Ukrainians will not make the same mistake they made in Bakhmut and Avdiivka in failing properly to evacuate their forces from that effective encirclement. Although there does seem to be an exit route at the moment, that itself is under Russian fire control. It's very dangerous, to put it mildly.
We put that same question to Yuri Butusov, the military journalist and analyst turned serviceman, and he had a slightly different take. He differentiates between Pokrovsk itself and some outlying positions that are already very difficult to supply, that are at risk of being encircled, but he does not believe that it is time to leave Pokrovsk.
На Покровську нема зараз оточення, і я не бачу, що противник міг його здійснити, насправді, тому там загрози оточення там нема. Але кілька наших підрозділів відрізані, і я сподіваюся, що вони будуть вчасно виведені.
What impact would losing Pokrovsk have on Ukraine's ability to defend itself? Are we going to see some kind of frontline collapse triggered by the loss of the city? I think if you were to go back 9 months, say, or maybe even a bit longer, people would be talking about the importance of the city for logistics, for supplying Ukrainian positions along the front lines that used to be to the south and east of the city. The reality is that those positions have already been lost. So actually, Pokrovsk has lost significance for Ukraine in terms of logistics. What really matters now is how Ukraine leaves Pokrovsk. If it happens in a timely fashion, in a way that avoids large numbers of soldiers being taken prisoner by the Russian side, or whether it happens too late and in a chaotic fashion. And the other thing is obviously how well they prepared for this. We understand that new defences are being built to the north and west to replace the defences that were in place in the city, and we will only know once they're tested in battle how well that was actually done. Frank Ledwidge believes that after Pokrovsk we could see an acceleration along the front lines, with Russian forces pushing further faster than they have been able to in recent months.
It won't be a decisive defeat. It's not a strategic defeat, but it will have strategic and conceivably, like any military outcome, may have political ramifications. It will give the Russians, or put the Russians in a far better position. If we look at the pattern of what happened after Bakhmut and Avdiivka, after these huge battles, Russians tended to move rather more quickly over the ground behind those very well fought, bitterly fought over cities than they did earlier for various reasons. And I think this is Syrskyi's general perspective, Syrsky being the commander of Ukrainian forces, that the longer we can hang on to these places, the better for those two reasons. First, the strategic problem of admitting defeat, pushing that down the road. And second, connected to that, giving time for further fortifications to be built.
One of the really striking features of this war has been quite how slow and protracted fighting in urban environments can be. Often enough, we've had a situation where the Russian army arrives at a Ukrainian town and the expectation from outside has been that things will be over pretty soon, only for fighting to carry on for weeks and months. That's exactly why Yuri Butusov, the Ukrainian military journalist and analyst turned serviceman, thinks that Ukrainian troops should try to stay in the city for as long as possible.
В Покровську ми зараз спираємось на значну кількість будівель. Ці будівлі, якщо ми їх просто залишимо, будуть використані противником як командні пункти, як райони зосередження своїх військ. І вся Покровська агломерація буде використана як район для зосередження і розвитку подальшого наступу в двох напрямках – на Добропілля і на Межеву. Тому я вважаю, що те, що ми зараз продовжуємо бої в Мирнограді Покровську, це абсолютно виправдано з військової точки зору.
Could Russia's advances around Pokrovsk have been avoided, and could Ukraine's military leaders maybe have done more? When you speak to especially foreign experts looking at the situation, lots of them are of the opinion that there is a certain inevitability to all of this, that in a situation where Russia has more resources, more manpower, that Ukraine at best can hope to cede territory as slowly as possible while inflicting the biggest possible losses on the Russian side, in the hope that at some point Russia runs out of steam, is unable to recruit more soldiers and comes back to the negotiating table.
But here in Ukraine, there are many critical voices, people saying that the military leadership and that the commander-in-chief, General Syrsky, could be doing more and could be fighting in a more coordinated way. They say that at present, military command all too often sends in elite troops to put out the fires at the last minute, rather than identifying problems early on.
Yuri Butusov, the military journalist and analyst turned serviceman, has an interesting take on this. He believes that even with current resources, if they were used better, if they were more coordinated, and modern technology were used more effectively, Ukraine would be able to stop Russia in its tracks right now.
На будь-якій війні, як показує світовий досвід, піхотинців завжди недостатньо. Тому основна проблема не в першу чергу. Це не необхідність нагнати якомога більше людей. Основна проблема – це правильно застосувати тих людей, які є. В даному випадку причина прориву противника – це те, що насправді це проблеми організаційні, управлінські. Відбувалося це не один місяць, ніяких неочікуваностей ворог не створив, нічого несподіваного там не сталося. Просто в силу якихось, очевидно, системних проблем не було реакції на те, що там відбувається в Покровську, Мирнограді. Не було реакції на заходи і взяття в полон російських піхотинців. Ну і в результаті ворог вже затягнувся значними силами в Покровськ. Нам потрібно створення лінії оборони, сучасної лінії оборони, яка буде передбачати створення кілзон для ефективного застосування дронів, яка буде заснована на захищених логістичних маршрутах, системах радіоелектронної боротьби, радіоелектронної розвідки, яка буде забезпечуватись надійними укриттями для піхоти великою кількістю, що забезпечить її живучість. І от коли все це побудувати, посилити мінними загородженнями, інженерними загородженнями, таку лінію фронту, яка буде оборонятись боєздатними керованими військами, Росія прорвати не зможе ніде. І це саме тому, що це війна сучасна і боротьба з ворогом, з наступом – це питання в першу чергу організаційне і управлінське. Україна має сили для того, щоб повністю зупинити російський наступ. Для цього потрібно почати робити висновки з наших проблем.
Will winter slow down the fighting? This part of Europe sees very muddy and often freezing winters, so it would make sense to expect things to quieten down in the next couple of months. Certainly the first winter of this war, 2022-23, did see a downturn in fighting, but I think that was probably more down to both sides having exhausted their resources than because of temperatures. And actually, if you look at what's happening right now, as autumn goes into winter, we're seeing the weather actually helping the Russians advance to Pokrovsk. Most people in Ukraine saw those extraordinary images of Russian infantry units on foot, some on motorbikes, rolling into Pokrovsk, all together in a way that is pretty vulnerable, but they were protected by fog, which stopped Ukrainian drones seeing and attacking them. So that has certainly helped them. That kind of cover has helped them now in Pokrovsk. And actually, when you look into the last few years, some of the biggest battles like Avdiivka, that was taken in the midst of winter.
Якщо ми згадаємо рік тому Покровськ, в грудні, січні, лютому під Покровськом йшли дуже інтенсивні бойові дії. Якщо це використовується нами правильно, тоді зима може бути завадою. Зима – це просто певна тактика і організація військ, і певна тактика боротьби з противником. Тому, якщо ми це можемо використати, так, зима нам допоможе. Росія проводить безперервну наступальну операцію і збирається її проводити до тих пір, поки ми їх не зупинимо на певній лінії фронту.